So first off, as always, just appreciate everyone's taking your time to join us today. We're looking forward to another good discussion. I know last week we had some good discussion, and I think hopefully all of us have a better understanding of role. And maybe there's still some confusion, but that's part of learning, is to be confused and then to understand. So just like before, and in every all these discussions that we've done, we just ask that if you do have any questions, obviously feel free to ask them. You can send in a chat if you're viewing this on your computer, or you can just check in and ask the question. And just be mindful if there's any background noise or anything, that you just mute yourself if you're not talking. And then if we do hear anything background noise, we'll unmute you. So we don't want to do that. Hopefully we'll get through today's call without any weird background noises. But like I always say, it's the odds of that happening are pretty low. So but anyways, today we're going to talk about dog legs and forced layups, and then a few other things that we normally don't deal with a ton in terms of elevation and wind. I mean, we deal with elevation, but in terms of how the book defines elevation in terms of golf courses in Michigan versus golf courses in Colorado or other mountainous areas of the country, that's kind of what that's one way that elevation is measured. So, and then we'll hopefully get into the first obstacle, or topography, but obviously it's time dependent. So without, we'll go ahead and get started here with dog legs. So dog legs and forced layups kind of fall under the same category per se. However, they're obviously a lot different in terms of what happens, right? So one is something that clearly cuts through the middle of the hole, that forces you to lay up. And then a dog leg can be both a positive, where you can't hit a full shot because the hole curves, but it could also be something where you could cut the corner and reduce the distance as well. So I think everyone knows what a dog leg is, so we won't need to go into that. But in terms of the of looking at it from a course rating perspective, like I said, there on our Form 1 that we have, you'll see that there will be a distinct line for dog leg and a distinct line for forced layup. So when we're writing in our sheet, we want to make sure we get it in the right line column, because obviously they are different things. Both, like I said, both can add yardage. However, a dog leg can also subtract yardage. So if you can cut the corner, that could potentially subtract yardage. And then again, like everything else, we're evaluating things differently for the bogey versus the scratch player. And then one of the things that Bob Carter mentioned last week, that begs repeating, is that when we are talking about forced layups, we have a actual forced layup, and then we have a layup by choice. And when we do a layup by choice, there's no length correction written down in our Form 1. We still make the adjustment to the approach shot, but we won't write it if it's a layup by choice in up here in the forced layup or layup column. So here's an example of, just so that everyone kind of knows too, like how the hole is measured. We have in this case here, when we're out measuring the golf course, our team will look at the course and measure to a pivot point at the dog leg, right? So here you can see there's a red dot at the tee, and then a red dot at our pivot point, and then a point here to the green. And that's kind of how we measure, and that's how the hole was designed to be played. But we understand that there could be circumstances where players could cut the corner, or maybe their full shot can't be hit because they don't want to go in the trees. So just to use an example here, obviously if our full tee shot is supposed to go 250 yards or 210 yards for lady, just using an example, and that point ends like right here in the trees, the golfer's not going to hit that shot, right? Now, in this case here, you've got trees all the way down the left side. So the likelihood of them being able to cut the corner is very, very low. So what they're going to have to do is they're going to have to lay up because of the dog leg, and they're going to hit a shot that is closer into this area here. Or if they can get it to a point, maybe it's right here based on the line of play. All of it depends on kind of the line of play. So maybe it's more like where these little dots are, where these carts are. So basically what we need to determine when we have a situation where the hole is going to be reduced because of a dog leg, we need to determine the point where the golfer can get to without having to deal with significant tree problems or things that might be involved with that dog leg. So typically what I've been taught and what I like to do is that, you know, when I get to this area, I like to make sure I look back at the tee that I'm rating, the tee box, and make sure there's no trees or anything that would prevent me from getting to that point. And once I determine that point, then I'm going to say, okay, this point is now my new length or my new approach shot. And then I'm going to adjust my form 1 to this length. So let's say that, you know, I was supposed to be at 150 yards, and then after determining my appropriate area for my dog leg or my landing zone for the dog leg, I end up at 170 yards from the hole. Then on my form 1, I'm going to just cross out my 150 here or whatever and write down 170. Okay, and then we'll just use this example here as starting off at 147. So on 147, that's a dog leg of 23, right? Correct me if my math's wrong, someone. But then I'm going to write 23 in here. Oops. For my dog leg. And then for those of you that have done this before, some other things that you'll do when you have, and you'll also make some adjustments. So we'll go back to the presentation here. So when we get to dog legs, we'll also have some adjustments for hitting less than a full shot. So let me see, I don't know if it's on here, but basically when we have on our form 1, if we're hitting less than a full shot, we're also going to have an adjustment. Make sure I can draw here. Have an adjustment for our fairway, a layup adjustment. So an L minus there. And then also for a R and R. So those adjustments go in there for any time that we're hitting less than a full shot. So the number needs to be positive in order for that to go in there. Because if we're thinking about a dog leg where we cut the corner and we actually decrease the yardage, we're still hitting a full shot. So we don't have an L adjustment for that. The only reason we have the L adjustment is because what we're saying, and really is what we're saying is that the fairway is going to be easier to hit because we're not hitting a full shot. And the rough and recoverability, or recoverability in rough is not going to be coming into play as much because we're not hitting a full shot. All right, so does that make sense for people? All right, so that's an example of a positive dog leg. So let's do one where we have a negative, and this one I think is a little bit harder to determine. But basically, let's just for the sake of argument, let's just assume that all this stuff down the left side is not trees, and it's just marsh, and we can cut the corner. So if we can cut the corner, then we're going to determine from our tee and how far we hit it, where our ball ends up, right? So let's just use let's use the male scratch golfer as an example. So the male scratch golfer hits at 250. So we need to determine from this point here at the tee to where 250 yards would be on a straight line. So let's just assume that it's here. So if it's here, that's going to be 250. And then we're going to measure from where we are here to the middle of the green. And then we'll get that yardage. And then we'll look at that yardage compared to what our yardage on our Form 1 is for our approach shot length. So let's just say for easy math, this is 130. Okay, so 130. And we're going to go back to our Form 1 here. And we'll use hole 2 as an example here. So actually, let's use hole 1 just because we said we were doing it for the scratch. So we will our approach shot's going to be 130. So we're going to cross this out and change it to 130. All right, but then in this case here, we are going to still do the dog leg. We're going to write that number in here. So that's a difference of, what is it, minus 46. And typically your dog leg's not going to be this large of a number. This is just an example with the form that we had. Typically your dog leg is going to be, somewhere between 10 to 20, 25 yards. You usually don't see a huge dog leg number unless you have like a 90-degree dog leg hole. But we've got our decrease here. Again, in this case, we're not going to do that dog leg or L minus adjustment because we're still hitting our full shot. So the fairway is equally hard to hit, and the stuff to recover from is equally hard or is equally going to come into play. One thing that I didn't mention in the last example, and one thing that we need to do is we need to take a look at our green target value with this new approach shot length. So we need to check and see if there's going to be any changes. So in this case here, we've got 130, and our approach shot's 130 now. Our effective, to find the green target, we look at our effective green diameter, which is 24, and then our approach shot. And then since we're doing a male, we go to the blue chart. Scratch golfer 130 to a 24 is a 4, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. And so then this number gets crossed out and turns into a 4. And so in our last example, there was probably an adjustment that we needed to make as well. But I did not do that. But we need to make sure when we are changing its approach shot that we do make sure that our green target doesn't change. If it does change, we need to change it. Any questions on Doglegs or any other comments that anyone wants to make?
Kyle, if you go back to your drawing there, this is Mark, by the way. If you go back to your drawing, you'll see that on that new line of play that the player took, that there is at least a partial crossing value that one should take into consideration.
Yep.
So a calculation of the yardage and then any sort of reduction, P minus reduction appropriate because it's a partial crossing, should be calculated in there as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So yeah, we would have in this case, we would have a crossing because we're assuming that this is marsh or whatever, and we would have a crossing there. And like what Mark said is that would be kind of a partial one because it's not a complete crossing like you would have if you were crossing something that ran across the middle of the fairway. And that's a good example. And for those of you that have done this a lot, that's a good example of a crossing that, you know, will not be on your sheet that you'll have to measure when you get out there. So we try to get as many crossings as we can. You know, all the ones off the tee, all the ones in front of the green. However, we're also assuming that the golfer plays the hole right down the middle of the fairway and plays the dog legs. And in this case, obviously that's not the case. Their line of play changed a little bit. So we would need to, you would need to do that measuring out there.
Hey, Kyle, we had a situation in Alpena. It was number 10, and I still get haunted thinking about how to do it. When you, I think, forget the exact yardage, but let's call it 380. It was a 90-degree angle dog leg. And of course, we measured it out and did what we had to do. But when we're rating it, we usually take our GPS and then we go and we get, when we're so far from the hole, for our landing spots. But as we went down the first part of the fairway, it was 180 yards all the way down the first length of the fairway, if you get what I mean, before you turn right. How do you do something like that? Because at every point of that fairway was about 180 yards from the hole because of the severity of the angle. How do you measure something like that? Or how do you do it when you're rating it to find your landing zone?
Yeah, so I mean, in that case, I guess just to understand, I think I understand the question, but are you saying that basically, like, no matter like I'm gonna be 180 yards away from the hole, whether I hit it like in a range of 160 yards to 200, no matter how farther I go forward?
No, I could be on the tee, and the GPS says on the tee I'm only 180 yards from the hole, and then I drive I tee off and I go down by the 30 yards short of where the landing zone might be, and I'm still like maybe 160 or 170 because it's the severe angle.
Gotcha. Yeah, so I think when we are measuring the course and when we have the numbers on the Form 1, those aren't going to necessarily match what's in the GPS, because the GPS is taking yardage as the crow flies, whereas we're actually measuring out to the pivot point in whatever. So does that help?
Well, I understand that. So how do you do that if our tools are normally to go off the GPS?
So I mean, I think we use the GPS as a tool to get to the right spot, but I mean, typically we're and I guess you have to be careful with this on your GPS for these dogleg holes, is that we want to make sure that we're actually we're getting the landing zone based on the yardages as they're measured, not necessarily what's on your GPS. I don't know if someone else.
I understand that that's what we want to do, but how do we find that spot?
So I typically will use the most courses have that at a minimum a 200, a 150, and a 100-yard marker that are in the ground. So I typically use those as places to get an idea of where I need to be. I don't know if anyone else has any ways that they do it or that they might want to share or talk about.
This is Mark again. The GPS can be very confusing, and it's basically an aid. It's not the determining factor. Along play, generally there are sprinkler heads. Typically they're marked. And as Kyle mentioned, there are typically some sort of yardage markers. From those yardage markers to get to where you need to go, you may have to pace off 25 or 30 or 40 yards at a yardage, or find a sprinkler head that's nearby, pace off yards plus or minus from a known point in the fairway. As I say, the GPS is, it serves as an aid, but it's certainly not something that you should be relying on.
No, the GPSs can be very problematic on Doglegs. They can really mess people up.
Yeah, I think they're definitely helpful and a tool. And I think once you get to a point where the hole is straight to the green, then obviously that number becomes a lot very, very valuable. But if it's not, if the point that where you're at is not directly straight to the green, then it kind of becomes something that you might want to discredit or discard until you get to a point where it's completely straight to the hole. All right, and then one other thing before we move on to layups on Doglegs here. If we have a dogleg correction that's less than 10 yards, then we're going to put 0. So we won't have a dogleg number that's less than 10. It needs to be at least 10 for us to make an adjustment. So in a lot of times, if you're quote unquote cutting the corner, you might be cutting the corner 5, 7, 8 yards. We're not going to worry about that and make any adjustments for those scenarios. All right, so for force layup, we have a couple. So we already kind of talked about the definition of force layup, but again, just to go over it again, it's when severe obstacle or a combination of severe obstacles such as a penalty area, deep bunkers, extreme rough, or severe topography crosses the fairway or reduces the normal landing zone width to less than 15 yards for men or 13 yards for females, and as a result, the scratch or bogey player will hit less than a full shot. And then a forced layup correction must be made because the effective playing length of the hole has been increased, right? So we see a lot of these. They're creek that runs through the middle of the hole. That's typically the most common one. There are other examples, but that's really the most common one. You might also have a scenario where you have some bunkers or severe bunkers and a penalty area that run laterally to the hole, and the landing zone or the fairway is less than 15 yards, and that would be another scenario where you'd have a forced layup. And then when we're recording, which we'll show you in a second on the Form 1, we also generally assume that they lay up 10 yards short of the obstacle. However, a downslope may make it necessary to lay up more than 10 yards short of the obstacle. So when we have a creek that runs across the middle, our layup point is not right to the edge of the creek where you've got another foot and your foot would be in there. It's 10 yards back is what we're assuming. And then keep in mind too, for any time that we don't hit a full shot, we're not evaluating roll. So if it's not a full shot or a layup shot, we don't do any roll adjustments. All right, so let's do some layup examples here on the Form 1. So if we have a creek that runs through the middle of the hole and it forces us to lay up, maybe we can't. Let's just do our hole 2 here, and we'll do our scratch golfer on the left. So they're supposed to be at 97 here, but at 97 yards is in the middle of a creek. And so we determined that our layup is going to be at 120 yards. So again, just like we did before, we'll cross out our 97 here, right in 120. And then we'll check to see if our green target's changed. So again, 120 yards, scratch golfer to a 26 is a 4. And that 26 that I said is this effective green diameter up there. So when we're determining the green target, we're looking at the shot length, and the type of golfer, bogey or scratch, and then the effective green diameter, and that gets us to a value of 4. So we've got a value of 4. And so then that our layup is then 23. So we write our 23 in here.
Kyle,
Yeah.
I've always found it easier, and it might be easier for the rookies, that instead of selecting that 120, what was it, 97, I would either take the 117 or the 127, which was closer, and then it would just be an even number and a lot easier to figure out.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion, Patty. Yeah, I mean we don't need to be super precise here. So in a lot of cases, like Patty said, it's a lot easier to just use round numbers. So saying it's a layup of 20, so that it's just a lot easier on the math. I think I definitely do that for sure sometimes. And then other times, I'll do something like this to get to a round number because I like having the round numbers on there too. But I mean, any way you do it, I guess that the point that I think Patty's trying to make, or that she is making, is that we don't need to necessarily get the exact precise number, and that if we're a few yards off plus or minus, it's not going to make a huge difference. So once we have our number in here, we got our 23. Again, with the layup, everything is going to be plus. Okay, so we don't need to worry so much about the plus and minuses on our layups. So on the dog legs, I should have stressed that more, that on the dog legs, it's really important that you have the plus or the minus there, because it makes a huge difference in the outcome of the rating. So here, since we're dealing with forced layups, we're in the forced layup, and we're writing a positive number down. And then because we're hitting less than a full shot, we've got an adjustment under the fairway, an L adjustment, L minus. And then also in R&R, you've got an L minus as well. All right. And then we could have a scenario where we have, like in this case here, maybe our example is that we have a forced layup for our scratch player, golfer on the left, but not for our bogey golfer. And we could have the opposite, where it applies to the bogey golfer, but not the scratch golfer. Or we could have one where it applies to both. But each golfer that we're looking at, each bogey or scratch player, we're evaluating differently, and the number is going to depend on where their approach shot is coming from. So it's not necessarily something that applies to both the scratch and bogey. We have to evaluate it individually. Okay. So we have so then the next layup category that we have is a layup by choice. So again, we talked about this before, but a layup by choice occurs when a significant obstacle or a combination of obstacles near the normal landing zone results in a scratch or bogey player choosing to hit less than a full shot. A fairway landing zone that is less than 15 yards or 13 yards for female wide, but without severe obstacles may be sufficient reason for a player to lay up by choice. A layup by choice will normally be employed in course management decisions, often by scratch players. And in order to qualify, the normal landing zone must present an unpleasant situation. So the example they give is like a downhill stance, the lie to an elevated green. Because the player has a choice as to whether to lay up in this situation and could play a full shot, no yardage correction is made. So again, we don't typically apply this a lot, and the main reason for that is that it's not something that happens a lot, and that it is primarily done by the scratch golfer or player in their course management decisions. It's not that it can't happen for a bogey player. It's just that it typically happens for a scratch player, and there needs to be, some reason that they would do this, whether it's a significant obstacle or a combination of obstacles. There has to be a reason to do this. We're not just doing this because, again, like I think I used an example earlier this year. We're not doing this because XYZ golfer is better wedge player from 100 yards as opposed to 60 yards. We're doing this because at 60 yards away from the green, there are deep bunkers and a penalty area on the sides, and from the scratch golfer's perspective, they can avoid those obstacles completely by laying up. So again, it's not something that we use a lot, but it does happen. And then this note here below at the bottom is a layup may be part forced and part by choice. So for instance, when a player is forced to lay up 25 yards because of a penalty area that crosses the fairway, but the rating team decides that most players would choose to lay up an additional 10 yards to play from the fairway as opposed to the rough. In this case, the additional 10 yards is layup by choice, and the correct length correction is 25 yards forced layup, and the approach shot would be adjusted by 35 yards. So we'll do an example of that one after we do an example of a layup by choice here. So if we have in this case here, we have we'll just use our hole 2 again, but we have a layup by choice, and let's say it's going to be for the scratch player because that's what it typically occurs for, and it's going to be, what to say, 20 yards. So again, what that wording said is that we are going to adjust the approach shot length here to 117. We'll look at our green target to see if that's changed. So 117 to a 26 for a male. Is a 4. But in this case, because it's layup by choice, we are not going to write anything in this column here in this forced layup. So we're just going to leave it blank. Another thing that I would recommend is when you do this, that you put somewhere in here layup by choice. So some people will write in, like right in this spot here. I've seen this on forms, LUC. I typically tend to write it down here. So layup, whatever, in the notes section below here. But it's important that you put it in there, because if you don't, then when we're reviewing the sheets after the fact, we think that you may have missed it, and we don't want to add the yardage in here if it was a layup by choice. So if you do a layup by choice, just make sure that you make a note somewhere, whether you write it up here or you write somewhere down in the notes below here that a layup by choice was done. And then we do still though, for layup by choice, we do still do our L adjustments. So we would apply our L minus adjustments here. And again, the thought behind that is the reason we're doing that, we're making those adjustments is because again, we're hitting less than a full shot.
So Kyle, your suggestion here obviously is to not put anything in the force layup box, but to make a note down below. Had I not heard that, I probably, if I'm writing, I would probably put something like by choice or BC or player choice up in that force layup, just because that's where the data would normally go if you're adjusting the approach shot.
Yeah, no, and I think like a lot of people do that. So like, I mean, if you do that, that's definitely a good idea too. So if you want to put like by choice, like you said, or I've seen LUC layup choice written up here. Yeah, it's definitely okay to write it up here. Just don't write the numbers up here.
Okay.
Because we don't write the yardage up here.
Kyle, help me understand two scratch players. One doesn't lay up by choice, the other does lay up by choice. Isn't that putting some subjectivity into the rating?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a good question. I mean, so when we're evaluating, I mean, we obviously like our scratch player is the same, like in terms of it's just how the book defines a scratch player, and so that's I guess I'm probably not doing a great job of answering the question, but basically that's one of the reasons why we don't do this a ton is because, scratch player A and scratch player B might think a little differently, but in terms of how like we're evaluating it, our scratch player is just a defined golfer with a handicap index of 0.0. And when we're thinking about the mindset of that player per se, it gets a little subjective. And when we do that, we kind of have to assume the average of that. We're not necessarily saying, well, if I was playing or whatever. So that's why we typically don't do it a ton. And the only cases where we really do it is where there is severe obstacles, and it would be a no-brainer for the majority of scratch golfers, if that makes sense.
May I just add something there? There's a couple of things we have to subordinate ourselves to, and one of them is Rule 5 on the inside front cover, and that is we rate the guide. We don't rate as you think someone would play it or as you think you would play it. So that's rule number 1. Rule number 2 on layups such as this is that there are strict criteria listed on page 14 of our guide indicating in what situation only can a scratch or bogey player choose to lay up, and they have to meet those criteria. So it isn't just thinking that A scratch player and B scratch player are going to play it 2 different ways. It's got to meet what's listed specifically there in the guide without any subjectivity. This is all objective based on what's written there in the guide.
Yep, no, that's great. Say that, Mark. Thanks. All right, so let's do in that last paragraph here, it talks about a combo layup by choice. in force layup. So let's just do this exact example here. So 25 yards, forced layup, 35 yards total layup. So in this example here, you'd have, we'll use our, let's do our bogey offer this time. Actually, let's not do that because that's gonna get us outside of our zone. Let's do this bogey offer here. So 56, so we're gonna add here, our approach shot length adjustment is gonna be add 35. So that's 91. And then we're gonna look at our green target numbers. So 91 for a bogey offer. 24 is a 4. So we adjust here to a 4. And then in this case, we still have, because we're hitting less than a full shot, we still have our L- adjustments under fairway and R&R. But here in our layup though, instead of writing the full 35 yards, we're gonna write 25 here. That was a bad 25, but it's supposed to say 25. All right, so that's how you do that one. I know that took me at least a year to figure that one out. I don't do it a ton, but you do run into that exact scenario that the book states, where it does make sense for someone to lay up to the fairway as opposed to hitting it in the rough. So I think that's something that definitely does happen, and something that we should all be aware of.
And Kyle, that's when it comes in handy to write down that layup by choice at the bottom, because then when we're going back and looking over the sheets, we know that people just didn't make a mistake doing their arithmetic.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point, Lori. And that's another thing too. Like when I'm looking over the sheet, it's at the end when I'm putting it in. I mean, I am very cognizant of any of these numbers or yardage changes that we make, because yardage has the biggest impact on the rating. So if you don't do everything exactly correctly on the sheet, I'm gonna either have to call you, or I'm just not going to make the adjustment out of caution, changing or impacting the rating. So it's just really important that when we're doing these dog legs and force layups, that we get everything exactly correct. All right, so the last example I wanted to go over is one that, again, and if you're new, take a minute break or bathroom break. But this example here is going to be of a scenario where you're going to have a par 3 and a dog leg or a layup correction turned it into a par 4. So the only time it matters is when it goes from a 3 to a 4, because the rating treats those holes differently. 4s and 5s, all the percentages and everything are the same. Obviously yardage is different, but from a par 3 to a par 4 does make a difference on the rating. So we're going to look at hole 4 here, and we're going to have, we'll just use an example of a layup for our scratch player. And the other thing to keep in mind on this example too is that when we're figuring out our par is determined based on the scratch player's length. Okay. So again, if you're new, don't pay attention to this or don't get confused by this. This is a little bit more advanced. But let's say on this hole, for example, we're dealing with a male and we're going to have a layup of 50 yards. All right, so 50 yards. So that's going to change this hole from 204 to 254. So you would want to make this adjustment here. And then the other thing, that's not a great job of writing, but the other thing that this does too, it not only impacts here, but we also are now, so because we know our scratch player hits at 250, this turns it to a par 4. And again, for par fours, now we're going to have a fairway value. So we're going to get rid of these zeros. And then our approach shot here is going to be a little different as well. So we won't go into exactly all the mechanics on that. I mean, obviously there's the layup here that we deal with, and then also in R&R as well. We might have a scenario too where our layup, when we put our layup in here, the largest number we can put in here is 50, but in this case, maybe it's more than 50. That's just the largest number that we can put in there that the system allows us. But we would adjust our approach shot and everything here. But when you do run into this situation, and it doesn't happen a ton, but when it does happen,
would that turn that into a transition zone?
yeah. So yeah, this was, let me just take a look. I believe so, but let me double check.
Doesn't the approach shot negate that transition zone because you've decided you're going to rate it as a layup?
Yeah.
So you got a 54 yards coming into the hole. There's no transition there.
Yeah, I mean, this was maybe, so let's just say for example, in this case, that our hole has a creek that basically runs from the front of the green to about 30 yards back towards the fairway. Right. So in this case here, there's really no way that we're going to have a transition zone per se. And really what we're doing is that maybe it's not necessarily 254. Maybe our approach shot in is, let's just call it, like John said, we'll just call it 54 yards or whatever. And then we would do our number based off of that.
Kyle, from experience, I've noticed that this scenario comes into play for people rating a male course on a typical par four, where the most forward or front tee would then be shorter and would be that 204 yards, but it may be a dog leg at the end, not typically set up to be a par three. The yardage brings it into a par three, but the rest of the hole and the rest of the tees might be, 300 and 400 yards. Just that forward or front tee shows up to be a one-stroke hole. And that's typically where they come into play.
Yeah, you're right. It's usually those like forward tees that we're doing for men, or some of the longer, so the forward tees for the men is typically where this comes into play, or some of the very, very short tees for ladies as well for the scratch player. Yeah, so this doesn't happen a ton, but I did want to throw it out there just because for those of you that are experienced and have done this, if you run into this situation, it's important from our perspective when we're getting the information that we have that we make this adjustment to a par four, and when we do that, we also cross out our zeros here and make sure we get fairway numbers for that.
And Kyle, may I also say that this is a new phenomenon, is it not? In the past, we've never been able to override zeros on fairway. If the computer information gave us zeros for fairway, we were prohibited from making any other numbers other than that. So this helps us in a lot of situations, and I appreciate you bringing this to our attention.
Yep. Yeah, I can't speak exactly to if it's how new it is, but yeah, it is something that is newer for sure. All right. So any questions on layups before we move on here?
We did have one pop into the chat, Kyle.
Yep.
Should we be talking par, or should we talk about 1, 2, 3, etc. shot hole?
Yeah, Ken. So that's a good question. So yeah, basically what we're in this case here, we're kind of talking about the difference between a one-shot hole and a two-shot hole, and that's really where it matters, because again, the numbers that go into the rating are different for par threes versus par fours and fives. Par fours and fives are treated the same. So yeah, another way to think about it is that a two-shot hole. But the thing we have to keep in mind is that our par is based off the yardage for the scratch golfer, not the bogey golfer. So if you have the same scenario here where your bogey golfer has to lay up, but the scratch golfer plays to the 204, we're not crossing out our zero here. Our zero stays because our par is based off that scratch player. Zero stays, but there are adjustments that you can make for when a golfer or when a player, a bogey player, does not play the hole in the amount of shots that par dictates. All right. Again, the maximum length for a layup or a dog leg written down on the sheet is 50 yards. However, it can be more than that, and you would still adjust the approach shot length for that. So if you don't want to have to remember that, just write down whatever it is in the column on the form 1. If you write down 80 here, technically speaking, that's not correct, but the program won't let me enter a number in more than 50, so I'll know to adjust it down. What's most important is that if the layup is more than 50, that we actually correct the approach shot length here to the right number. All right. Elevation. So when we're looking at elevation, we measure elevation from tee to green. That on our sheet, that's the elevation that we're getting. So it's tee to green. That is done by the measuring crew and will be given to you in advance. Just for your information as well, though, it needs to be at least 10 feet, and we round to the nearest 10. So if it's 8 feet elevation, our number on the sheet will be 0. When it's 15 feet, the number on the sheet will be 20. If it's 13 feet, it'll be 10. So you might see some elevation, but your sheet might say 0. That just means that the elevation is somewhere between 9 feet and 0 feet. Doesn't mean that there's necessarily 0 elevation. And again, that's on our form 1. That's in this tee to green elevation row here. The other instance where we're looking at elevation will be in topography, and we'll talk about that in a later session. But when we're on our sheet, when it's listed, we're looking at tee to green. And under topography, we'll look at approach shot length elevation. Then for par 3, the max elevation is 40 feet. Again, you won't need to worry about that. Our measuring crew will take care of that. And then wind. So wind has its own thing. We've done some experimenting with wind, and it has not necessarily worked out the way that we were hoping, and it created some kind of weird results. So what we typically do is we have, like it says in the sheet or on the page here, we generally have 3 levels of wind. A normal wind, of course, that's windy, and of course, that's very windy. So I know that's not super intuitive, but this is something that we do kind of internally and with the captains. And basically, what we've done to come up with these kind of levels is we look at courses that are on the coast. We have a lot of those in our state. And then we also look at one of our former captains had got a list or a map of all the wind turbines in the state. And so we also look at those to determine where we might have elevated wind ratings. So typically you'll see are higher wind areas on coastal courses, places in Northwest Michigan, in the Thumb, and in mid-Michigan. So that's kind of how we determine that, but that is, this is new to the rating system, I believe, as of 2016. Okay, and then I want to cover this before we get done today. We'll just really quick, we've actually kind of already talked about this a little bit, but when we get into our obstacles in the coming weeks here, we have a scale of basically 0 to 10 for our obstacles. So we have to keep in mind when we're doing this that 4 is average, a significance on an average golf course. And if we flip back here, we'll see that at ratings of 3, 4, and 5 should be expected about half a time on an average golf course. And a rating of 10, which is the highest, would normally be expected on less than 1% of the holes that we do. And then there's also a few examples of obstacle minimums that we can't have a 0 for those 3 obstacles there. There's minimum values for that. And then we have the scenario that we talked about earlier in a previous session where we have that the obstacle does not exist, it's 0, but we have to keep in mind that an obstacle, if it is within 50 yards of the line of play, it does quote unquote exist, and that it needs to be recognized with a value. And that's typically a value of 1. And so here, and then at the bottom here, or sorry, at the top, again, just when we're talking about these obstacles, we consider the likelihood of the obstacle coming into play, and then also the difficulty of recovering from the obstacle. So when we're also thinking about this, though, the other thing to keep in mind is that for a lot of our obstacles that we're evaluating, these 2 principles are built into the table. So we're not necessarily making subjective thoughts about these 2 things on a lot of our obstacles. Some we do. Some, like topography and trees, are a little bit more subjective, and that we would consider these 2 things. But a lot of the tables, we're just going to take the value that is given, and then we might consider some of these for potential adjustments, possibly. But a lot of times, all the difficulty is built into the table based on how far the shot is, and how close the obstacle is to the line of play. And there's a good example of an obstacle here where it comes into that 7 to 10 range. If you have a par 4 hole with formidable bunkers in the landing zone, and it requires a long approach shot to a small green surrounded by deep bunkers, and you've got a bunker value that should be in the extreme significance range. When you have it come into play on the landing zone, you've got a small green and the bunkers are very deep. All right, I think I don't want to get into start a new thing, but we'll pick up topography next week. We'll stick around if anyone has any questions. I know we covered, the Doglegs and forced layups are really, really important, like we talked about, in terms of making sure that those values get corrected, because like we have talked about before, distance is very, very important. So making sure those are right is really important. So we'll stay on if anyone has any questions, but we'll look forward to getting into topography and a few of the other obstacles next week.
Just a quick question again regarding the guide itself. Is the 2016-2017 guide still the current one, or is there a new one out now?
Good question. So the newest guide is the 2020 guide. If you don't have one, reach out to us, Theodore, if you want to put my email, my phone number in the chat. But that's the 2020
Yeah, of course.
is the version that you'll need. It's $23 to get. It will last you through the 2023 season, and we'll ship it to wherever you're at. If you're in Florida, we'll send it to you. If you're in Michigan, we'll send it to you, so you can have it and start to study it, and then have it to use when you're out there on the course.
Can I just stop by the office here in Metro Detroit and pick one up and pay for it?
So we're not working in the office. We're all working remotely except for our accountant. So unfortunately, that's not really an option right now. If you want to set up an appointment with us, we can do that. But it'll just depend on our availability.
All right.
Oh, well, I think some people left. But one thing I wanted to mention as well too is that one of the things that we are working on, we're working on a partnership with Bushnell. So for any of you that are in the market for a rangefinder, I would recommend holding off on making any purchases because we're working on a deal where we'll be able to get you a fairly significant discount. If you're looking to get a rangefinder or a GPS